Hello, welcome back to the Introduction to Linguistics seminar. This time the 10th occasion. We're now moving on to look at the last part of linguistic study that we're going to be looking at. That's syntax, moving on from morphology. Now, syntax is the next logical step to take after looking at the way we put words together from smaller units called morphemes. What we're now going to be looking at is how we then take those words and put those together to form larger units. Obviously, one of the larger units that we form by putting words together is sentences. And that's going to raise an issue about what a sentence is. Okay, so let's take an example by taking some words and putting them together to form what I think everybody would believe is a sentence. So John loves Mary is a sentence. So the question is, what is it about this that makes this a sentence as opposed to something else that isn't a sentence? What actually counts as a sentence? Well, as we can see, we have some words here arranged in a particular order. Now, that order is changeable to some extent, in as much as you could put another word order and still add a sentence. So John loves Mary and Mary loves John are both sentences. They mean different things, but they both count as sentences. But it's not just any order that you can put words in to form sentences. So, for example, you wouldn't be able to change the love and Mary to get loves Mary John, which isn't a sentence. Moreover, you have to have the right number of words in a sentence, so you can't miss things out and get something that constitutes a sentence. So, loves John isn't a full sentence, and certainly Mary John isn't a sentence. So what we can see then is that sentences have to have the right number of words put together in the right way. So one question that we could ask that might take us some steps forward into understanding what exactly a sentence is, well, what's the smallest number of words we need to create a sentence? It's fairly obvious that one word by itself isn't enough to create a sentence. So John, for example, isn't a sentence, and neither is slept. But if we put those two words together, we do get something that I think we can accept as being a sentence. So John slept is a sentence. And generally it's accepted that we need at least these two parts to form a sentence. The first part is usually referred to as the subject, and the second, the predicate. Okay, so we need at least two elements, a subject followed by a predicate, in order to make a sentence. So the minimal sentence then consists of a subject followed by a predicate. Now the subject is typically a nominal element. That means it's something to do with a noun, and the predicate, on the other hand, tends to be a verbal thing. It's something to do with a verb. So clearly, the category of an element here determines where in the sentence we can put it. Nominal elements, nouns, can go in the subject position, and the subject position comes in front of the predicate. The verb goes in the predicate position, therefore follows the subject, follows the noun. So quite simply put then, the positions that words occupy in a sentence are determined by their category. Or another way of putting it, it's the category that determines the distribution of the words in the sentence, because sentences consist of certain positions which are reserved for certain categories. Nouns go in the subject position, which comes first. Verbs go in the predicate position, which is second. Okay, and essentially that is what categories are all about. Categories are simply groups of words which go into the same positions in sentences. Okay, a category is simply a group of words, or the property of a group of words, which allows them to be inserted into those positions. Now, once we've identified that they've got these two positions in sentences, the subject position and the predicate position, the next move from that is to recognize that these positions are not just word positions. but actually they can be occupied by more than one word. So let's take our sentence, John slept. The word John there could be replaced by the man. Okay, and it's fairly obvious that in this sentence, the man occupies exactly the same position that John would have, inasmuch as the man is the subject of this sentence. Furthermore, could expand it even further. So the English teacher slept. We've got three words instead of the one that we started with. Or even more than that, the English teacher from France slept. Or the English teacher from France who I told you about slept. In all of those cases, that first group of words acts as the subject and therefore occupies exactly the same position. The same thing can be said about the predicate. So the predicate doesn't have to be just one word, it can be many. So let's take our sentence again, John slept. We can see that we can replace slept with slept soundly, or slept soundly in his office, or slept soundly in his office because he couldn't go home. So we can see again here, we can replace a single word with a group of words, and those words sit in exactly the same position as the single word does. Now, these groups of words, therefore, form a part of the sentence. They are a constituent of the sentence. Clearly, they're bigger than words, but they're not as big as sentences. So even though there are lots of words in the English teacher from France who I told you about, it doesn't by itself constitute a sentence because it doesn't have a predicate. We need the predicate slept to be put after that to form the full sentence. So what this points out to us is that there are things which are bigger than words but smaller than sentences. And these are things that we call phrases. So the English teacher from France who I told you about is a kind of phrase. Similarly, slept soundly in his office because he couldn't go home is another kind of phrase. And again, these phrases, just like words, have positions in sentences, and therefore there are different types of phrases. The first type, the English teacher from France, etc., that's the kind of thing that can go in the subject position. And we've seen that's a nominal position. So there's something nominal about this phrase, whereas slept soundly in his office, etc., that's something that can go in the predicate position, which is a verbal position. So there's something verbal about this phrase. So let's have a look at more detail about what these kinds of phrases can consist of. We'll start with the subject, that is the phrase which is nominal in nature. And the one thing that we know that can go in there is something like a noun, like John. Well, the way to describe this then would be to say that there is a position in the sentence which is for nouns. Let's draw that as our first step. Okay, so there's a noun position, and in that position we can put in nouns like John. But we also know that this noun is something which can occupy the subject position, and the subject position is more than just a noun position. It's a noun, it's a phrase position, a nominal phrase. We can represent that with NP. So an NP can be made up of just a single word, that is a noun. So John can sit in the noun phrase position. Of course, we can also have more words inside the NP. For example, we can have a noun like teacher accompanied by a word like the, as in the teacher. Now, this word is often referred to as a determiner. Okay, its category is that of determiner. It's sitting in a position where other elements of the same category, such as the word a, as in a teacher, or this teacher, or some teacher, or every teacher. These are all determiners. They all sit in the same position. And as you can see, they come before the noun inside the noun phrase. Sorry, inside the NP. So we can represent like that. We've got a determiner position, here represented by the letter D, and in that position we can fit determiners. That comes in front of the N inside the NP. That's not the only thing that we can have inside the NP either. We can put between those two words a word like an adjective, like the patient teacher. Again, you might think, therefore, what we've got is an adjective position inside the NP, and that simply comes between the determiner and the noun. However, there's a bit more to be said about that in this case, because although we've got, in this case, an instance of a single word, we could expand that word into something bigger by adding something like very, for example. We have a very patient teacher. Now, it's fairly clear, I think, from this, we can see that very patient is something that goes together. In other words, that is a kind of phrase within the noun phrase. Very is of the category degree adverb, and degree adverbs are something which accompany adjectives inside a phrase which they make up. We call that an adjectival phrase, or an AP for short. So inside the NP, there's a possible position for an AP that comes between the determiner and the noun. So we can have the very patient teacher. Very patient is an AP with an adjective in it preceded by one of these degree adverbs. Furthermore, we can add something after the noun inside the NP. So something like from the school. Now, this is, again, it sounds something that sticks together. It seems like a phrase all by itself. And again, that phrase has a position inside the NP. This phrase is made up of a word like from. This is of the category preposition. Prepositions are words like on, under, through, by, from, for, etc., etc. These kinds of words tend to come in front of something like the school. Now, the school is something made up of a determiner, the, followed by a noun. And we've already seen that a determiner followed by a noun make up a noun phrase, or an NP. So what we could say is then that this phrase from the school is a phrase which also contains an NP, the school. I'm representing this in this drawing here with a triangle. What that means is simply that the words the school go together to form this NP, but I'm not giving you the details of what those words are or the internal structure of that NP. I could, of course, have put D and N in, but just for exploratory purposes, I'm just putting a triangle here to show you that this is how you could represent a structure if you don't want to give all the details. So you can abbreviate it, as it were. Now, this NP then sits inside another phrase which has got the preposition in it. Now, we call that phrase, the phrase that's made up of a preposition followed by an NP, a prepositional phrase, basically the kind of phrase that has a preposition in it. And very typically, preposition phrases consist of a preposition followed by a noun phrase. That preposition phrase then sits inside the NP following the noun. And there we have a structure of a nominal phrase that could sit in the subject position. Note, it has an internal structure. It's a phrase that can contain other phrases, and those phrases can contain other phrases. Moreover, you start off with an NP, and then somewhere inside that we end up with another NP. So the whole thing, the very patient teacher from the school, is an NP, but also the school is an NP. This is a very important aspect of language, where if you can get a phrase of one type inside another phrase of the same type, what that means is that you keep on having such phrases. An NP can contain an NP, and then that NP can contain an NP, and that NP can contain an NP, etc., etc. That's the reason why language is essentially infinite. We can keep on putting phrases of the same kind inside phrases of that type indefinitely. This is known as recursion, and the fact that language is recursive means that more or less there are an infinite number of sentences that it's possible to produce. Let's have a look at the verb phrase then. Again, just like we saw with the noun, the verb phrase can consist of just a verb. So there's a verb position for verbs to go in, and that's all you need for a verb phrase in most sentences. So slept is a possible verb phrase as well as a verb. The verb phrase can consist of one or more words. Another word that you can fit into the verb phrase is a word that comes in front of the verb, another verbal type element. This kind of word, like has, as in has slept, is usually referred to as an auxiliary verb. So again, we've got a position for an auxiliary verb inside the verb phrase before the verb. We can represent that like that with aux as the abbreviation for the category of this element, showing the position that these kinds of words can go in. Furthermore, again, we can expand our verb phrase by adding something like an adverb, like soundly, slept soundly. Note, here we've got this adverb following the verb, but just as equally, we could have had it in front of the verb, between the verb and the auxiliary verb. So we could have said, he has soundly slept. It seems that adverbs are more flexible than, say, an adjective, whereas an adjective always comes in front of the noun. The adverb can either come before or after the verb inside the verb phrase. For now, let's just look at this thing inside the verb phrase, and again we might think that that means there's an adjective position inside the verb phrase either before or after the verb. But again, just like the adjective inside the noun phrase, we can find that this thing, this adverb, can consist of more than one word. So that would seem to suggest that what we have here is not just a position for an adjective, but a position for a whole phrase. And again, we can modify this adjective with the same kind of word, like a degree adverb, like very. So he has slept very soundly. That leads us to exactly the same conclusion as we had before with the adjective, that actually adverbs and adjectives are both parts of phrases which can contain other words like degree adverbs, such as very. So there's an AP inside the VP, either preceding the verb or following the verb. Furthermore, we can add other kinds of phrases here, this time following the verb again, something like in the car. Now, in the car is another instance of one of these preposition phrases. It's got a preposition in, followed by a noun phrase, the car, and then that goes together to form a preposition phrase. So once more we see then that the verb phrase can be complicated. It has internal structures. It can contain phrases inside phrases. Now, we've seen then that a noun phrase can consist of just a noun, and a verb phrase can consist of just a verb, and those two together can go together to form a sentence. The simplest way of representing that would be to do just like what we've done before, and this time we put that NP into a position inside a sentence and the VP into another position inside the sentence. Both of those things go together to form a sentence. So we end up then with a complete diagram showing the structure of this sentence. It's a very simple sentence, but as we know, we could make it more complicated by adding a more complex subject NP and a more complex predicate VP. So we could have something like this. Now, that may look complicated because there's a lot of stuff going on there, but if you look at it, the structure of this sentence is exactly the same as John slept. It's got an NP and a VP in it, and the NP comes in front of the VP. It's just that this NP has more stuff inside it and this VP has more stuff inside it. But even that, again, we can see is fairly straightforwardly represented here. The NP has got a determiner followed by an AP, followed by a noun, followed by a preposition phrase. And the AP itself breaks up into a degree adverb plus an adjective, and the preposition phrase breaks up into a preposition followed by a noun phrase. And exactly the same is going on with the VP. The structural representation we've got here then shows us the ways in which we form this sentence, not just simply by putting one word after another word after another word, but by combining those words first into phrases and then into larger phrases and ultimately into sentences. Okay, and this is known as the structure of the sentence. And we're representing the structure of the sentence here in terms of what we call a tree diagram. It's called a tree diagram because, well, it looks a bit like a tree. It's got branches coming out from certain parts, and those things branch into other branches, and then right at the bottom we have the words, which are a bit like the leaves on the ends of the branches. Now, we don't have to represent sentences using a tree diagram. There are other ways of representing exactly the same thing. One way is to use what we call labelled bracketings. What that means is we just simply put brackets around the elements, and we label the first of the bracket to show what the thing is. So, for example, John, we know, is a noun, and we can represent that by putting brackets around that with N on the first bracket. Similarly, with sleep or slept is a verb, we can put that those brackets around that. We also know that John is a noun that can appear inside a noun phrase all by itself, and that slept is a verb that can appear inside a verb phrase all by itself. And again, we can represent that by putting brackets around John and slept, labelling the first one of the first pair of brackets NP, and the second, the first element of the second pair of brackets VP. And finally, we know that those two NPs and VPs can be put together to form a sentence. So we can put brackets around the whole thing, labelling the first bracket there S. Now, note that gives us exactly the same representation of this sentence that we would have had using a tree diagram. It says exactly the same thing, that this sentence breaks up into a noun phrase followed by a verb phrase, and that the noun phrase contains a noun, which is John, and the verb phrase contains a verb, which is slept. So exactly the same information is given here by this representation. You may well wonder then, well, why do we need the two different types of representation? What's the point of having two things to do exactly the same job? Well, the issue is very much one of use. It depends on what you want to use these things for. Label bracketing are things which are by far easier to produce. You can write a labelled bracketing on one line, and you can type in the brackets, the square brackets, at the same time as you type in the words. The only thing that you might need to do is to put subscripts on the brackets to write in the labels, but you can do that fairly easily on a computer. So they're actually fairly straightforward to produce. They don't take up very much room on a piece of paper. The disadvantage, however, of a labelled bracketing, I think, is already apparent from what we see here, that when they start getting too much information in them, they start becoming difficult to read. You have to figure out where the start of a bracket actually ends to show you what the constituents of the sentence is. So, for example, that first bracket labelled S doesn't end until you get right to the very end of the whole thing. So the very last bracket is the closing bracket of that S. The NP, on the other hand, doesn't finish as the second to last bracket. The second to last bracket is actually where the VP finishes. The NP finishes as the second closing bracket after John. So you have to sort of track these things, and as you can imagine, if we had a very big sentence like the very patient teacher from Paris slept soundly, or slept very soundly in his car, or something like that, if you had something like that, this would look extremely complicated. It'd be very difficult to track where the opening brackets finish and where the closing brackets, which one they're related to. For that, a tree diagram is far better. Tree diagrams are harder to produce, but they're much easier to read. They represent the structure in a way that you can see what the structure is at a glance, as it were. So it very much depends on what you want to use the representation for, and how much information you want to put into it. So, for example, we can actually produce a very simple representation of a sentence using label bracketings, as long as we don't put too much detail in. Remember, in a tree diagram we could miss out detail by putting in a triangle. Well, it's even easier to miss out detail with a label bracketing. You simply miss out some of the detail, just don't put it in. So here we've got the same sentence represented using brackets, but we're just not given the information that John is a noun and sleep is a verb. And this is far easier to read, and in fact it's easier to read if we've got a long and complicated sentence like the very patient teacher in the school slept very soundly in the car. As you can see, we're just not putting in all of the details there. We're saying that this is a sentence made up of two phrases, a noun phrase and a verb phrase. And it's fairly easy to read that. So it depends on how much detail you want to put in, and if the detail isn't important, then a label bracketing can be fairly straightforward to use. If, on the other hand, you really need the detail, a label bracketing is going to be quite confusing, and a tree diagram would be the best way to go. Okay, so let's summarize what we've said in this presentation then. Okay, so we've seen that words combine with each other into sentences, but not simply just by putting lots of words together in any order. No, there's certain positions in sentences where certain words can go, and those positions are determined in terms of the phrases that we build up. There are certain positions for words and other phrases inside phrases. So we firstly put words together to form phrases, then those phrases into other phrases, and those phrases, etc., until ultimately you get to the sentence. In other words, sentences have internal structure to them. Phrases can consist of one or more words, so you can have a single word phrase, there's nothing wrong with that. So one word can be a phrase all by itself, though obviously it's also a word at the same time. What that means is that there is, inside the phrase, there are positions for words as well. We've seen that sentences have two main phrases. They can have other things, but for now we'll just stick to these. That every sentence must have a subject and a predicate. The subject is typically a nominal phrase, so that's the kind of phrase where we find nouns and the kinds of things associated with nouns like determiners and adjectives and things like that. The predicate is typically a verbal phrase, so that's the kind of phrase where we find verbal related things like verbs and auxiliary verbs and adverbs, etc. There are, of course, other kinds of phrases. We've seen two of these. We've seen APs, which are either adjectival phrases or adverbial phrases, very similar in terms of their internal makeup. They could both consist of adjectives and adverbs with perhaps a degree adverb in front of them. The difference is where they appear. Adjectives appear inside the nominal phrase, and adverbial phrases appear inside the verb phrase. We've also seen prepositional phrases. There are other phrases to be seen, but for now that will do. Okay. See you in class then. Bye.